Hi, my name is Moaz, and in this video we will be going through the first lab of the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Professional course. And in this lab we will learn how VPC endpoints provide private connectivity from your VPC to your AWS resources. We will use an EC2 instance running in a private subnet to reach our S3 resources via VPC endpoints and enforce access with an endpoint policy. So a lot of the initial lab setup will be done by CloudFormation. We'll be using a CloudFormation template to create the environment for this lab, and that CloudFormation template will create a VPC with both a public subnet and a private subnet. The public subnet, both subnets will have an instance running in them, so public command host, which will run in the public subnet, and then private command host in the private subnet. It will create two security groups, lab instance security group, so a security group for our instances and then a security group for the VPC endpoints that we'll create. The lab instance security group will allow all outbound traffic and will have no inbound rules, and then the lab endpoint security group will allow inbound HTTPS traffic from within the VPC. And it'll also create two S3 buckets. It'll create a data bucket and then a logging bucket. And the purpose of the logging bucket will just be to store any access logs, so any requests that are made to the data bucket. All those logs will be stored in the lab logging bucket, and as part of this actual lab, we will be creating the VPC endpoints, so SSM interface endpoints and S3 gateway endpoints. Now we'll head over to the AWS Management Console, and from here we're going to head over to CloudFormation, and we're going to click Create Stack and upload a template file. So this CloudFormation template will be provided as part of this lab to spin up all the resources that we need for to complete this lab. And one thing you'll need to do is go into the CloudFormation template and replace anywhere you see this AWS account ID variable with your account ID. I've already done that for myself, so I can choose that file, click open, click next, and you can leave all the defaults. You need to enter a stack name, and it has to be unique within your account. Click next, and you can leave all the defaults again. Sorry, you need to acknowledge this, so it might create some IAM resources. Click next and submit. And now you will see that it's creating different resources. If you hit reload, you'll start to see that it's actually creating all the resources. And if you keep reloading this events tab here, it will keep showing you the progress of the different resources it is creating. And so we're going to wait for this to change to the create complete status. So once the CloudFormation stack is in a create complete state, all of the resources have been created, and we're going to head over to the AWS Management Console and actually confirm that these resources were created. And if the CloudFormation stack is in the create complete state, it means that it did successfully create all resources, or it would have given you errors and failures to let you know what resources it was not able to create. But we're going to go ahead and look through the management console anyways, just to explore the different resources that CloudFormation stack created. And this is all for the initial setup for our lab. So it created a VPC, and you can see that lab VPC right here. If we go to subnets, you'll see that there are two subnets, and there is the private subnet and the public subnet, and they're both for our lab VPC. And if we go to route tables, there's two route tables. The private route table is associated with the private subnet, and the public route table for the public subnet. If we go to the private route table, we can see the routes for the private route table. And if we go to the public route table, we can see the routes in the public route table, and you can also see the internet gateway here. Next, we're going to head over to EC2 to see that the EC2 instances have been created. So if we head over to EC2, there are two instances running, and we can see the private command host and the public command host. So the private command host instance should be running in the private subnet. So if we go down here, we can see that it is in the private subnet. And then if we go to select the public command host and we go down, we can see that it's running in the public subnet. And it also created two S3 buckets. So let's go look at the S3 buckets. So if we go to S3, and let's filter by creation date, let's sort by creation date, there is the data bucket, and then there's also the logging bucket. And so if we go into the data bucket, over here and go to Properties and go down to Service Access Logging. So it says Log Request for access to your bucket. All of these logs will actually go into the logging bucket, and we've enabled this, and CloudFormation did all of this work for us. So we completed the steps of creating the baseline environment with CloudFormation and verifying all those resources. Next, we're going to actually try to connect to both the public instance, so the EC2 instance running in the public subnet, and the private instance, the instance running in the private subnet using the session manager. And it'll work for the public instance, but it won't work for the private instance, and that is because we haven't created the SSM interface endpoints. And once we do create those, then we should be able to connect to even the private instance using the session manager. So let's head back to the console, head over to EC2. We go back to instances, and if I connect to the public instance, I can connect it using the session manager, and I can run commands. But if I select the private command host and I say connect, it gives me an error saying the SSM agent is not online. So in the next step, before we actually create the SSM interface endpoints, we're going to try to access S3 using the public instance. So let's go over to the public instance. So we should be able to access S3 from the public instance. So AWS 3ls. We can see all the buckets that we created. We can also list the objects in the bucket. Let me grab the name of the bucket. So the data bucket is empty, and the logging bucket will also likely be empty. We can look at that one too. And it is very likely that this logging bucket will be empty even at the end of your lab, even though you've made some access requests to the data bucket, and that's because the logs are asynchronous, so they're not put and uploaded right away in your logging bucket. It can be a delay of up to 30 minutes or more, and so you can, if you keep the bucket for longer than that, there should be logs that are being uploaded into the logging bucket. But that's not the purpose of this exercise. But we are going to upload something into this bucket via the AWS command line interface. So I'm going to go ahead and create a file that I can upload to our data bucket. So I'll create this simple file, and I'm going to copy it into our data S3 bucket, and it successfully uploaded. So now if I try to list the contents of the data bucket again, you can see that that file exists there. Now in the next step, we're going to actually create the SSM interface endpoints, and once we create these 3 endpoints, we should be able to access the private instance using the session manager. So let's go over back here to that management console and go to endpoints, which should be under VPC. And we're going to create all 3 endpoints. Create endpoint. Let's name this SSM. Select the service. And we'll select our VPC. And we're going to be selecting the private subnet. So the private subnet. And we're going to be selecting the endpoint security group that the CloudFormation template created for us. And we're going to give full access. I'm going to be creating the other 2 endpoints a little bit quicker because the process is almost the exact same. SSM messages. Find SSM messages. And the endpoint security group. And then we need to create one last endpoint. And that will be EC2 messages endpoint. Okay, select our VPC. Select the private subnet. Make sure I select the private subnet, yep. And select the endpoint security group. And we're going to leave full access for all of them. And create endpoint. And now once all of these are available, we need to wait for all of these VPC endpoints to become available before we go back and try to connect to our EC2 instance via the session manager. So once all of the endpoints are available, we can head back to EC2, and now we should be able to, let me filter by just running so we don't see other instances. So now we should be able to connect to the private instance using the session manager. So we select the private instance, click connect, and you can see that I can connect to the using the session manager. One thing I did want to mention is that you might have to wait a few minutes after the endpoints become available for the session manager to start working. Sometimes it takes a few minutes, and you may possibly even have to stop your instance and start it again for this to become available. But waiting a few minutes should work. Connect. And you can see that I'm successfully able to connect to the private instance um, through the session manager, and I can do something like ls and list all the files. Um, and now we're going to move on to the next step, and that's going to be to try to reach out to S3 from the private instance. And you're going to see that I'm not able to do that because I haven't created the S3 gateway endpoint. So if I go over here and do something like SWS3LS, it's just going to hang forever. And you already know that from the public instance we can access S3. So the next step is to actually create that S3 gateway endpoint, and we're going to then be able to access S3 from our private instance. So we go back to endpoints, click create endpoint, and that's right, S3 gateway, and search S3. And now you want to select this, for type it should be gateway, and select our lab VPC, and we're going to select the private routing table for this. And for now, we're going to give full access, and then later we're going to actually use a custom policy to only allow access to the data bucket and not the logging bucket. So it looks like it's already available. So the S3 gateway endpoint is already available. Now if we go back to the private instance, so you saw that it was hanging before, that same command, and now if I do SWS3LS, I'm able to actually list all the all the buckets in S3, and I should also be able to list the actual objects in each bucket. Do that, and we can see the public.txt file that we uploaded. And let me also try to see the logging bucket, which is likely still empty. But it does allow me to list the objects in both buckets. It doesn't give me any errors. And in the next part of this exercise, we're going to use this custom policy and add it to the S3. So we're going to edit the S3 gateway endpoint policy, which will only allow us to list the objects in the data bucket and not the logging bucket. So if we go back here and we go to endpoints and we select the S3 gateway endpoint, actions, manage policy, and now we're going to use a custom policy here. And over here we're going to actually have to put in the names of our buckets, so let me do that quickly. Okay, so I updated all the names and removed any variables. Click save. And now if we go back here and we try to list the objects in the data bucket, I'm still able to do that. But if I do the logging bucket, I get an access denied error. But this new policy should not affect the public bucket at all. So I can list the objects in the data bucket, and let me find the logging bucket. Let's see where that is, right here. And I'm still able to list the objects in the logging bucket, and it is empty, but I don't get any error here. And now in the last part of this exercise, we're just going to be cleaning up all the resources we created. And if we go ahead and just delete the CloudFormation template, the CloudFormation stack, it will actually delete all the resources that it created. But we did create the endpoints ourselves, so I was actually on the endpoints page. Let me go back to that. So we should delete those manually ourselves because CloudFormation did not create those endpoints, and it won't delete them. So if I select them all and I say delete VPC endpoints, so it should delete all of these. But other than this, we can go to CloudFormation. And we select our stack and say delete. And it'll start to delete everything that it created. There's a good chance it's going to fail to delete the bucket in S3 or the buckets in S3 if there's objects in it, so you might have to manually go empty the buckets or even manually delete the buckets. So this delete in progress will change to delete failed, and you can go manually empty the buckets and maybe delete them as well. And then this button here will allow you to do retry delete, and it'll continue to try to delete everything. And once it changes to delete complete state, that means it has deleted everything, even if you had to manually delete stuff on your own. And then you can be satisfied that all resources that the CloudFormation script created are now deleted. So the CloudFormation stack has changed to delete complete status. It actually did fail at first, and I had to manually go delete the bucket like I was telling you about before, and then I did retry delete, and it was able to confirm that everything was deleted. And that is it for this exercise. Thank you so much for listening.